What we're going to do today is very simple. Just give a quick overview about the operations and the work of the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council, and deal with some myths and stuff about legends, I suppose, and the work we have to do. But also, I'd like to also open it up because one of the things that is very strong about the council's work is getting out and listening to people. I call it listening with your ears and listening with your eyes, where you get out and you actually listen to the conversations, but at the same time you're looking around and you're seeing things. So you're in a community and you see the houses, you see the standard of the houses, you see the infrastructure, you see what's happening at the schools, and that's listening with your eyes. And of course then you're hearing the conversations, what people are saying back to you. So we're not get up here and talk a lot. In fact, we want to listen to comments and listen to what people have got to say about things. But first of all, I've got to thank Jambai and thank Andrew for being here. And just in regard to the three of us, if people think we fly around on government money and that, I can say that we're actually paying for these trips ourselves. In fact, out of every 10 flights I fly around Australia, 9 of them I actually pay out of my own pocket. And the idea is that we actually get out there because we're a council that is made up of some very committed people and very strong beliefs in the Indigenous affairs space, and it's quite a good mixture of people. First of all, the Prime Minister's Advisory Council is an advisory council. We don't make decisions. Any decisions that come out of government is government decisions, and any work that comes out of government is driven by the public servants under the commands of the government. We're an interesting advisory council because we only answer to the Prime Minister. We don't answer to the Cabinet. We don't answer to any other ministers. We answer directly with the Prime Minister, and he attends our meetings as well as the other ministers as they need to do presentations to us and have conversations about the work that we do. The other thing too is quite interesting about us is we don't actually vote. There's no votes conducted at the council. The council is a group of people who have been brought together because of their skills, experiences and knowledge within their own working lives, with their own personal lives, but most importantly of all, their contact and work with Indigenous people and how they get out into communities and talk about things. So, it's quite interesting in that there are no votes, so there is really no council view in regard to this. We sit and have conversations after doing research and looking around at areas and putting our views to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister then takes the views that they wish to take. And we hope that they take all those views together and mix them up and come out with the policy drives that they need to do. Now, that doesn't mean that sometimes we do have a consensus. We do have some consensus, but still it is individuals putting their viewpoints together to the Prime Minister. So that's a unique and interesting way of actually doing things. And I can tell you from our conversations, they are quite frank, quite interesting, I suppose the word is, and we have very open discussions about what government and what we think government should be doing in these areas. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're all accepted by government, but they do listen to us, and that's one thing I do praise the Prime Minister and the other ministers about. They do listen. Now, the next few weeks, in fact by the 28th of August, we've got to report back to the Prime Minister as council members on our thoughts on a number of very important reports and strategies that are going around. One is on the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, which is the government policy. The other is in regard to the Forest Review, as it is known, the Forest Review, and our thoughts and what should be done in those areas. The other, of course, is in the McClure Review in regard to the welfare and its effect upon Indigenous communities across Australia. And of course there's the other body that's operating out there, which we need waiting for their review to come back on, which is the Empowering Communities Review. And that review is looking about 8 trial sites across Australia in regard to how do we shift government out of community controls, and we get communities actually running their own affairs and running their own things, which is very much a focus to us. The other thing in regard to the council is it was created to give advice to the Prime Minister, but in a particular area. One of the things that when the Prime Minister approached me about being chair of this body is that we wanted to really focus on areas which were not, that is a lot of effort when that was going into. And we wanted to focus in areas which supported other activities that were happening with Aboriginal communities. So, for instance, in regard to education, we've got 3 areas we've got to focus on: for education, employment and community safety. And the reasons those choices are because we believe they're very strong about supporting other activities that happen. So when we talk about education, we're not only talking about getting parity with the Indigenous parity with the rest of Australia in regard to reading and writing and maths and science and English, but we're also talking about how culture, how languages, how Aboriginal history, Indigenous history should be all part of the curriculum and should be all taught not only to Indigenous people but also across the board in Australia. One of the things that we knew why the Minister for Education, Christopher Pyne, opened up the door in curriculum in regard to the Black Arms stuff, but we took advantage of that by putting a case and an argument to them in regard to Aboriginal languages, in regard to Aboriginal history and culture being central in those schools if we were going to keep kids at school and attract them. So the other things is in regard to employment. There's no doubt if we are really going to lift Indigenous communities out of poverty and to get them to be on par with the rest of Australia, then employment plays a massive role in that. It also means we have to look at things differently in communities. We have a belief that when politicians actually and other groups of people look at Aboriginal communities and say there's no jobs here, so these communities need to be closed, we say that is stupid talk. We find that, one, we're living in a free and democratic society, so the idea that you can just close communities and truck people off is ridiculous. Those things ended in the 30s. The other thing too is that we actually believe if the communities are going to survive and move forward, then we need to look at about how we create employment, how we get economic activity happening within those communities. And one of the big arguments and debates that we think is missing from this area is that there are a lot of things that need to be done in Aboriginal communities. It's just that in most cases they're not done by Aboriginal people, they're done by other people. And two, that there are jobs that can be created in this area, and we need to be focusing on the micro enterprises and small businesses that need to be put into communities rather than some of these big picture stuff. Because, you know, despite the work of the mining industry and the tremendous work of it, because I do praise them in regard to, you know, they were dragged to the table kicking and screaming through the native title process, but they've actually sat there and listened and improved what they're doing and doing a good job in it in regard to it. But the mining industry doesn't employ many people. That's one thing about it, and it's also becoming very technically advanced, and you're looking at trains with no drivers and trucks with no drivers and a wide range of other activities happening in the mining industry, which will mean employment will even shrink further. So it's about how do we create things and do things in remote and regional Australia which will create those jobs. And so they're some of the big challenges that we have to have and how we do these things. The other big part of it is we have to get out in communities. So I spend 2 days a week flying around Australia, going into places like Umbladawitch, Utopia, Leonora, Wiluna and many other places, sitting in the dust, listening to people and what they got to say, listening to their hopes and dreams, what they want for their kids and for themselves, and going forward to that. So out of a conversation over an hour, I probably will say 5 minutes. The rest of the 55 minutes is them telling me what they think and what they want. And then we take that back to our council and we sit down and we put those points to the Prime Minister as well as our interpretation of those points as well. So this is how the council operates. this is how we move forward. And for other people, when they accuse us of not being a representative body, I say we aren't, and I agree with them. We were appointed by the Prime Minister for our differing skills to really break through a barrier which we need to break through now. Some people say that if we are, these things will take generations, and they may be true, but we believe that if we don't start today, you won't fix the generations of the future. On that note, I might leave it. Is comfortable? Is right? I might leave it at that, and I'm pretty much opened up to any questions or anything like that if people want to raise with us, because we like to get out, we like to be spoken to, we even sometimes get abused. If anyone looks at my Twitter site, I think I get racially abused and abused about 100 times a day. So we're pretty happy to get out there and listen. So any questions, anyone? Yes, sir.
Hi, Warren. I'm not going to abuse you.
Oh, good.
So don't worry.
You better not. I know your dad.
No, I know. I wouldn't do that to you. Of course not. Not that sort of person. Hey, I just... I've heard your comments on radio, I think it was, or something recently, and I believe in the classic words of... what's that poet? It escapes me now. Rudyard Kipling. You know, your words can be used and twisted and put back at you. And I think that's what may have occurred, and I'd like you to just clarify for us... Sure. Your view on ceremonial practice, because obviously that's important to a lot of people here. It's very important to me, and I know it's important to you, and I think you're being misrepresented, so I thought this could be an opportunity for you to clarify. Oh,
good. Thanks for that. It's yeah, words, and to make it worse, I'm not a Kipling. I'm just a poor old Bunjalong guy from Grafton. As people know, I'm pretty blunt with my words. And that because it comes from 35 years of frustration within this space. One of the things that people raise all the time is in regard to monies and money spent in this area. I'm actually a believer. You know, I looked at some of the statistics. You know, we spent $50 billion in the last 11 years in Indigenous affairs, and you look at that, and we still got the problems we've got today. It tends to tell me there's a misery industry around us. There's a lot of people making a lot of money out of our misery, and we need to change those things. So that's why I'm pretty blunt when I say things, and I'm pretty happy to live and die by what I say. In regard to that issue, it was an interesting thing. I did a speech about, when we're talking about education, you look at the education in Australia, which is a British European education system, it come out of their culture. It come out of the development of their culture and their society. And I believe it's important that we need to do that for Indigenous people. If education, and I think there was a Yungal person who said it quite well, and that is that, it is our culture. It is cultural rights for us to send our kids to school. It is also the rights of school to represent us. And so therefore we need to take ownership of the education system. We need to have our culture and our development going into that, as well as, we're living in the 21st century, so you need to do the things that you need to do in regard to the science and the maths and the English. But it is our language, it is our ceremonies and stuff to do. Now, in reference to that, there's been a bit of an industry that's grown up where people use things not to attend schools and stuff like that, and we're looking at ways about changing it, and Jambawa has been very much at the forefront of our thinking in regard to it. The idea that I think culture and think that sorry ceremony is bullshit is quite frankly a load of rubbish. I think people need to go back to my speech, look at my speech, what I said, and work forward about how we can win this battle in regard to Aboriginalising the school system for the benefit of us. Anything?
It's a great relief to me to hear that you think it's rubbish that people will be moved off communities. Is Tony a bit of the same mind?
Look, he's an interesting guy, Tony. Actually, me and him. Look, I'm not going to be going to be very transparent. We don't agree on a lot of things, but there's one thing that we do agree on, and I see a lot of energy and drive in him, is his Indigenous space. He's not going to be sending the trucks in and sending people and moving off communities. It's about us in regard to making sure that we can make communities sustainable, and that means economically and safety and otherwise. That needs to happen, infrastructure that needs to go into it. No, he's not going to be going in there sending the trucks in and shifting people out. It's about how do we create the jobs and how do we create things to happen. If people want to move or people want to stay, that's their rights to do that.
Warren, Fred Chaney, I just wanted to thank you for your comments on the same point, which I think are important. And I wanted to ask you, my own impression is that over successive governments it's become increasingly difficult in remote communities. The people haven't felt they've had much room to breathe, let alone think about a better way forward. And I wondered whether you would think this is a rather out of touch with reality view, or whether you agree that a lot of those communities are under a bit too much pressure to enable them to really think their way forward in the way that you've outlined.
Oh, look, there's no doubt about that. There's rapid changes, and I'm actually surprised. You know, prior to coming here, I've been following the media for the last 2 days, and the comments, and I'm actually excited by what's happening. I'm excited that there's going to be a lot of change and a lot of drive forward. But the question is going to be about, are our communities ready for this? And I think, you know, I was listening to Gulleroy when he was talking in regard to the land rights stuff, and he's very honest about it. He said sometimes we weren't ready for things to happen, but you know, things are moving ahead. I think there is a lot of pressure, and governments and other people put too much pressure on Aboriginal communities. And one of the things I always talk about is, you know, you could almost make a career. In fact, people do sometimes make a career out of meetings, having to attend meetings. Some government agency turns up and they're expecting this, expecting that. I think we have to do the simple things first. One is that we have to be listening and working with Indigenous people and working under their leadership. And if they say no, it's no. And then if they say yes, it's yes. And you need to work with them about moving forward on those things. In fact, I made a comment when I was having an argument with a Green senator, and I said, look, I'm very happy to accept, this is in regard to mining, and people know I'm a supporter of mining industry. If they don't want to have mining, and it is the way of the community, then they don't want to have it. That's it. If they do want mining, then they should be allowed to have mining, and that's my argument. One of the things we're looking about is how do we get the recognition, and this also falls in with the constitutional arguments about recognition of the power structures and the leaderships within Indigenous communities, because I don't think people actually respect and pay homage to that stuff. I think we need to start getting back to the powers, to the recognition of the power structures and the way Aboriginal people make their decisions. Don't know if that made that. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Good. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Warren, John Morse.
How you going, John?
Good, mate.
Great presentation on the tourism stuff. Good.
Thank you. And thank you for your support on that too. One thing I didn't say yesterday, that Lirrawee tourism here in northeast Arnhem has gone from a $30,000 turnover 2 years ago to a $500,000 turnover this year, and creating part-time work. Thank you. Part-time work for over 200 Yolngu people, and that is just the start. So, but that's not my question. That's a plug.
No, I gave you an opportunity to praise yourself.
I know, thanks, mate. It's not me. It's not me you're praising. It's the Yolngu.
Yeah.
My question is: last week, I think, or the week before, I saw a very brief report in one of the papers in Sydney that Beyond Blue had released a study that indicated that over 50% of Australians think that Aboriginal people receive an unfair financial advantage from the government, which I think is an extraordinary finding. Are you aware of this report, and are you taking it on board as an advisory group?
Yeah, look, I saw the same report as you've seen too. It hasn't been raised at this stage with advisory council. But it is something we need to talk about, that the myths that are travelling out there. You heard the conversation earlier with the constitutional recognition campaign, that there is a lot of myths, and to be quite honest, people just do. I think it was Tanya said it. People just make up things and say it. The issue for us isn't that there is not unfair money being spent in the areas, and we need to get that message out there. But the problem we're having is the way that funds are actually allocated and dealt with, and the massive bureaucracies that work in this area. As I said earlier, we've created a circle of industry of people living on us on our misery. We need to change that, and one of the arguments I'm putting forward is how we do an audit. We look at how Indigenous funding is spent across the board, and what we're discovering so far is that most of the money doesn't even get out of Canberra or Darwin or Perth or Brisbane. It's just swallowed up by those huge bureaucracies, and very few amounts go down to the local level. And I believe that the productivity report's already done 2 reviews on this and said exactly the same things. So it isn't about that money's given to Indigenous community. It's the way that money is being spent by bureaucracies, and that we need massive reform in this area so that we do get the money down onto the ground. There is a danger in that, of course, and I'm having conversations with the Treasurer about some of these efficiencies that we could put in the system, but the danger is that through those savings, and it goes back into consolidated revenue or goes in some other space. So it's about those arguments of saying, okay, if we can show you where you can do your savings and where you can get efficiencies into the system, we want that money to be reinvested. And one of the things I'm arguing about in reinvestment is the savings we're looking at from the housing stuff is to be reinvested into the education system, that we start pushing from 2015 forward in regard to culture, languages, and the top teachers we need so much in the schools, and the infrastructure that we need to go into communities. Plus, money is also going into how do we invest in micro and small business within communities and drive those forward. Yeah. But it is a massive campaign. We should be telling people that Aboriginal people are not getting an advantage out of this.
Warren, at the risk of hogging this space, I'm just wondering whether you could ask the Prime Minister to have a word to Adam Giles and have a conversation about the urgent need, the fact that the time is of the essence in terms of Indigenous languages. Things are going very, very well locally here from what I hear. I come from New South Wales like you do. And I know that it's possible in Gamilaroi in New South Wales and possible in Bundjalung, but I'm not seeing kids being able to get their HSC in those languages yet. But they can in I think at least 47 languages from overseas. So time is of the essence. There isn't the room for more generations to pass because the knowledge, as you know, is built into that language. And that's not only in the interest of those children, but it's in the interest of all of us that we can finally start to listen and understand the workings of this land that we now live in. We can't do that if the languages die. Bilingualism must be returned to the schools up here. There are only 3 of 22 that are now have bilingual programs. It's a sad, sad death, and I wouldn't want to be the politician that had responsibility for that on my hands.
Yeah, look, you're right. You're so right. I'm not going to pretend I'm an educationalist, but I'm not. But in what the educationists are telling us, and this is one of the areas we need to put some stronger resources in, because you just can't just say hit languages at school without the backup of those resources, is they tell us that if you learn in your first language, you've been taught in your first language, you pick up knowledge and you pick up skills quicker than you do in your second, third, or fourth language, which is English. So one of the things I advocate for is that we actually do have schools where you're taught in your first language, and that means, but that does mean a lot of resources in that area. So it's an interesting conversation I'm having with Treasury, but we will get through that. We will get through that because it's so important. The other areas, of course, coming from New South Wales, and I've got to say, Victor Dominello, the Minister, has been very successful setting up those language nests. He's set up eight language nests now in regard to Bundjalung, Gamilaroi, Wiradjuri and stuff like that to do those, to bring those resources back. We do need to fight those battles and get those across. And my belief is if people talk about economics, they talk about commercial activity, they talk about jobs and everything else, people will get that and will move into those jobs, will get those educations that if their language and that is respected. Now, language in Indigenous communities, like languages in a lot of other places, it's not like being at school learning French or something like that. It defines who you are. It gives you your link to your culture and to your country. And it is very powerful, and I think people don't quite get that. So, yes, sorry. Yeah. Doing a good job there.
Hi Warren, my name's Rosie Elliott. I always think there's a problem with the National Training Reform Agenda in the 1988, and I think remote community workforce has really suffered in a lot of ways as a consequence of that. We know that in most remote communities that don't get advantages from mining, that there aren't the employment opportunities. We know that, and the main employment opportunities are in the clinic, the police force, the shop, the council, the park rangers. That's where the jobs are. And I won't speak about any other states in Australia or any other industries, but just the Aboriginal health workers, as an example. We know that even though the positions are still there, they're more and more filled by white fellas. And the Aboriginal health workers have long wanted a living wage for doing their training on the job. That is what they've asked for years and years. But they've been forced, as we know, to go to external schooling to get Certificate 4s. The old ladies have been excluded from the operations because they can't get they don't want the Certificate 4. We know there are many cultural problems by this one-size-fits-all that happened with the National Training Reform Agenda. So that's the call the health workers, like I said, living wage on the job, with training on the job and community selected. Yeah. This is for remote communities. So that's one issue, but I'm not sure if you're looking to... You've already said we can get rid of 550 million without affecting services.
600, I'll even put it up a bit.
What?
Yeah. 600 million, I think.
Was it 600 million? And you're saying there's another 600 million that you could find. Now, well, I'm not quite sure how... What we need is more services and more support, especially for the Aboriginal workforce on the ground. They're not going to be doing bakeries or little hairdressers in remote... I mean, there's not a living in that. They need support to do those industries. Yeah. To keep... I don't think Tony Abbott's going to send in trucks to remove people from communities, but it'll have the same effect if that workforce is not supported on the ground.
You're right. That's the issue about people being. The idea of shifting people not by the trucks, but shifting them by their employment and by their welfare benefits process. Look, I believe that you can create jobs and you can do things within Indigenous communities and make things happen. And I've seen it. I deliberately chose not to go out in some communities with entrepreneurs rather than with corporates, because corporate people are just like bureaucrats. They just work their way up the ladder. No insult to any mining executives out there. They work their way up the ladder. When you need someone to sit there, I remember I was with Jerry Harvey and we walked around an Aboriginal community together, and he just went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 jobs. And at the end of that day, we knew that we could put in an extra probably 15 jobs into that community that were paying jobs. Okay, they're not going to be $100,000 a year or more. They're going to be, the 45, 50, 60 grand a year. But they are jobs. And our job. What we need to do is the people who are working in the mining industry to spend their money at home. So where you get people, Aboriginals, who are working the mining industry, who are earning 80, 90, 100,000, 150,000, some of them are, a year, we need them to spend their money at home. So you do create a shop, you do create a coffee place, you do get a place where you cut your hair. These are jobs for people who are staying at home. So it's about, those are the type of jobs that are going to make Aboriginal communities sustainable and able to move into the future. So they're the type of stuff that we've got to do. We've got to actually take the blinkers off some people. I just suddenly realised I've got sunglasses on. But I'm not trying to be groovy. I'm just there's a prescription. Anyway, so it is about creating those jobs and keeping those jobs in those communities and moving forward. There are a number of good organisations out there who are doing a number of reports, and I'm looking at you, Fred, in regard to Desert Knowledge and other places. We need to listen to some of that stuff, and we need to formulate it into policy and drive past some ideological issues. You know, we saw John Anderson here talking about we need to get above party politics, and we do need to get above party politics. And we need to be pragmatic, and we need to make the decisions that are tough and things that will happen. And that's one of the things I'm very pleased about the members of the council, is that all of them are very pragmatic, very real, and they do give and they're not shy about putting their point of view across too. Yeah.
My name is Anne Rebgetz, and I'm principal of St Columban's College at Caboolture in Queensland. We have 45...
Oh, sorry, I should say this has to be the last question too, because they're waving at me over here.
Okay. Sorry, you can't hear? You can hear me
You need
now?
to put the mic close to your mouth. Yeah.
Okay. I was just saying my name is Anne Rebgetz, and I'm principal of St Columban's College, which is situated in Caboolture in Queensland, of nearly 1,000 secondary students. Prior to that, I was co-principal of Wadeye School for 3 years. Warren, you spoke about education as being so important. Mm-hmm. And in the previous session, we heard that the key to constitutional reform is probably in the young people's vote. Mm-hmm. And educating the public. One of the things you also stated, which is very true, is that in terms of skill sets and the mining companies, the skill set for employment is getting to be a higher, more demanding skill set. Yeah. From my experience, which is first-hand, I have seen on a daily basis what I would call the bureaucratic malignancy. I had people that would ring me in my position when I was at Wadeye, and their job was all day to monitor how many people were at school, and they would ring 3 times a day because they were reporting to someone in Canberra, and that was their job. Or they would fly out on a plane that might cost a $500 return airfare, plus their wage would be at least $500 for the day, to come and give advice on how to run a particular program that at the end of the day they wrote a report on. We have a very dire situation in terms of education. In terms of the statistics have not improved. We heard Nova talk about the 40% incarceration and the 2% of the population. We are not going to get change in terms of that. We're not going to get the employment, because if you don't have the educational standards, education and employment go hand in hand. We have a whole generation of Aboriginal people who did not attend school. We have second-generation parents who are illiterate and innumerate. This is a crisis situation in terms of this in our country. In other countries, when they face this situation, they've taken a visionary steps in terms of education to achieve change. In China, they've achieved change and improved their statistics overall by partnering their high achieving schools in the country with the poorest achieving schools in the country, and actually giving them the responsibility of enabling and helping those students to actually get to their performance. And it has worked. My question is, when are we going to stop kidding ourselves with the way we're doing it now to actually get the change that is needed, that is going to make the rights of the children really be heard, and to get the change in this country so that we retain and have longevity in terms of our Indigenous history, culture and future?
I couldn't agree with you more. We have to get fair income. But as a nation we have to, because I was looking at OECD figures the other day, and in education we're slowly falling down the ladder. We're getting lower down the ladder and we're getting worse. And we're starting to get to the stage that we're going to be overtaken by a number of countries. You know, looking at some figures of Indonesia, the next 15 years and that will be overtaking us in economic growth and that. Now you think about those things, and it is the way that, and it's the way our education system is run as a whole. In remote Indigenous areas, look, there are some great people out there working, but you've got to look at the overall statistic. It isn't working for us. And we need to change it, and we need to do a revolution to do that. And we need to put the resources and the battle in, because if we're going to change things, then it is in education that is going to be the central to that to happen. And that's not only looking at kids, but is also looking at adults too, about how we should be working with adults and do that. Because one of the things I heard a lot growing up was we need to forget a generation and look after the kids. People forget that the first teachers you have are your parents, your family and your community. So if they don't see value education, they don't see the importance of it, then you're not going to see the importance of it. So for me, it's in regard to looking at the getting kids to school process. We need to argue the case that stays at a community level, and it is the community that is working on it and getting the kids to school, but also arguing the case for the schools to be what they want and what they need for their kids to be educated and supported. If we have punitive measures and that going into these areas, I believe, this is my personal view, it's not the council's, anyone else, my personal view, is that you're not going to win this battle. You've got to have the community and the families seeing the value of the education, seeing the value of the work. Otherwise, the whole community is not going to move forward. So what we've got to do is what is in the best interest of the community and how the community does this. The issues I see, and it's not only an Indigenous issue. You go into Western Sydney of New South in New South Wales, and you look at I think it's 28% youth unemployment in Western Sydney. So it is a problem we have, and they're getting in their second generation of people who can't read or write either. So we've got a massive educational issue across the board when it comes. So when we look at these things, yes, we see them as Indigenous issues, but we also see them as a very much a socio-economic problem that we've got across the board in Australia, and we need to tackle it. Yeah, look, I agree 100% with you. Thanks. You're always very exceptional, Marcia. Good.
I'd like to ask you, Warren, as the chair of the Indigenous Advisory Council, to have your council pay attention to the parlous state of the Remote Community Jobs Program. Yeah. It's really just not working. There are some pretty serious problems because of, Centrelink bureaucracy, the rules and all of that. It's urgent that we get RJCPs working, and I think it's all hands on deck with this one, so that's a request to you, formal request, please.
And again, we agree.
Thank you.
And we're on the same page on this. We agree with this because we need to... look, some of the programs are very good programs, but the problem is the implementation and how they're operating, and that is a good example of it. I've been out in some of those communities, and you think that this is a good program, but how it's implemented and how it's operating is a disaster. And so it's a lot of work we've got to do in that area, and that's another one we want to target by the end of this year in the 2015 budgetary round as well. So thanks for having us. Thank you for your patience, and good on you.